Excuse me. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Daily Word number 759. As always, I'm glad you could join me for our time together and our conversation about Scripture and its meaning for us and its continued call and tug on our lives. I'm always grateful that you could join me and carve out time to be with me and to say good morning or good afternoon or whatever it is, and whenever it is that you watch and join in this conversation. As always, our hope for these daily words is that you find a nugget or two, maybe not every day, but on some days, a nugget or two that you can then use to help you in your daily living. I was in a conversation earlier this morning over breakfast about, when this began, we've talked about this, when this began, a couple weeks, just help us stay together a couple weeks. And then we'll get through that darn pandemic. Now we're all these 759 days later together. So here we are. And our scripture this morning is a familiar one. It's the call of Simon and Andrew as disciples. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew casting a net into the lake. He said, "Come and follow me." This is a call story, of course. This call, and I will make you fishers of people. And we know the story, right? For some unknown reason, they just left their boats and their fishing gear and their families and their parents and their nets, and they went and followed Jesus without really a clue of what they were signing up for. Just knowing that their life would be forever changed. And of course, it's interesting that they came back to fishing after the resurrection, because that's also what they knew. And it's where Jesus encountered them again, and that their call hadn't stopped. Actually, Jesus reaffirmed their call. Simon, who then becomes Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, now Peter is reinstated by Jesus. And the disciples then, they experience Pentecost. They're sent out. They are the disciples, the apostles, the beginnings of the early church and what that means. I started reading a book yesterday. It was actually a recommendation from another book. I'm a voracious reader. I read 2 or 3 books at a time. I'm not always successful, but that's how I kind of live my life. And I'm reading a book called The Resilient Pastor. And in one of the early chapters, the writer says that he was granted a sabbatical after many years. He said that in the church they served, they weren't allowed to miss more than 2 Sundays ever. But they were granted a 6-week sabbatical. He said 6 weeks doesn't seem like a long time, but 6 weeks was enough to change my life. And he said, my wife and I decided to read a book on sabbatical called Under the Predictable Plant, an exploration in vocational holiness. And it's by Eugene Peterson. And Eugene Peterson is the author of The Message, the translation of the Bible. And so I started reading that this morning, or yesterday actually. And part of the story is a call story in that. Now, the authors of the Resilient Pastor book said that they read this book and it showed them how to be really good pastors yet again. And when I read that, I'm like, that's what I want to do. I want to be a really good pastor. And so I started reading this book, and it's based around the story of Jonah. The prophet Jonah, who's called by God to go to Nineveh, but Nineveh's a tough place. Instead, decides to go to Tarshish. Well, we know the whole big story, right? Jonah follows God, but then is disobedient to God and wants to go to this easier, fancier place. And it's really about call, about what it means to be called and what it means to live out our call. And the subtitle, An Exploration into Vocational Holiness. Now, I know that all kinds of people, in all kinds of places, in all kinds of ways, are called to follow Jesus. Not just pastors, but all kinds of folks. Folks who do miraculous tasks in all kinds of jobs that without them in those particular places, companies, businesses, factories, banks, gas stations, restaurants, they just wouldn't run the same. There was a conversation last week on Facebook about how long folks had been waitresses and waiters and servers. And, I know many waitresses. And, I said to them, especially a couple of them, look, it wouldn't be the same without you in that particular place, living out God's call on your life. I believe that to be true for us. Sometimes, we, including me, and I think that's what has drawn me to the reading of this book. When this author of that previous book, The Resilient Pastor, said, look, I just wanted to be a really good pastor, I thought, man, if he can say that, that's what I want to be. So I'm going to read this book. And I want to find again in my life, this vocational holiness. And I think for all of us, we can find in the midst of our lives vocational holiness. We're asked the question maybe in this whole call story, what are we doing with our lives? What are we doing with our lives? How are we answering the call to come and follow and to live out what Jesus has called us to? Now, I'm not very far in this book. I'm just reading the beginning chapters of it. But I was reminded in this, come and follow me, Jesus said. And they left and went, and their lives are forever changed. But they had moments in all of their following Jesus where they had to rediscover their vocational holiness. They talked about being the greatest, and Jesus said, look, last will be first, and first shall be last. They talked about who's going to sit on the right and who's going to sit on the left, and Jesus said, look, the kingdom's greater than all of that. When they wanted to send the crowds away because there wasn't enough food, Jesus said, bring them to me. And there was enough food, and all these baskets of food left over. There was the crucifixion and the resurrection and the going back to being fishermen. The Jesus re-engages them, and their vocational holiness is found yet again. We find them on Pentecost Sunday, right? With the wind blowing through and the understanding of languages and them rediscovering their vocational holiness. That's what I want to try to do. Maybe spending the rest of this summer reading this book and trying to figure it out. My last sabbatical was, I don't know, 2000, maybe, something like that was my last sabbatical, a long, long time ago. But for all of us, we have this continued call of Jesus, come and follow me. Come and follow me. And the question may indeed be, what are we doing with our lives? And so that's the word that is important today for us, because we have the ability to use our lives to make a difference in the lives of others. And that's really what I want to do for the rest of my time in ministry and the rest of my life. So hopefully that's a word that we can all resonate around, this idea of rediscovering our vocational holiness. And just know that no matter what we do in life or what we've done in life, we've been called by God to make a difference. So thanks for joining me for our time together. I pray you know of God's love that surrounds you, know of my love for you, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Have a great day.